In global politics, the word anarchy doesn't mean chaos or violent riots in the streets. Instead, it means something much more specific: the strict absence of a central governing authority above the nation-state. Without a world police force to dial in an emergency, sovereign states are forced to rely entirely on what political scientists call a self-help system. In this environment, physical and political survival becomes the supreme national interest. For decades, the dominant framework for understanding the struggle has been realism. But realism isn't a single static doctrine. It is an evolving scientific tradition that attempts to map exactly why states behave the way they do. All realists agree that power struggles are a permanent feature of global politics. Where they fiercely disagree is on the locus of causality. They debate the specific independent variable that drives this perpetual conflict. To locate this cause, scholars use an analytical framework called the levels of analysis. Think of it as a three-layered map. You have the individual at the core, surrounded by the state, and enclosed entirely by the international system. The first level isolates the human psyche and the innate nature of leaders. The second examines the domestic institutions and internal politics of a specific country. The third zooms all the way out to the structural geometry of the global architecture itself. We can track the entire evolution of realist thought by watching where theorists place the blame for war. We will follow that causal mechanism as it moves from the flaws of human nature out to the structural constraints of the international system, and finally back into the mechanics of domestic politics. The earliest phase of this tradition is classical realism. This is an inside-out approach. It argues that state behavior is simply a macro projection of innate human nature. If humans are inherently selfish and power-seeking, the sovereign states they build will act in the exact same way. This idea is grounded in the long history of realpolitik. Ancient thinkers, like the Greek historian Thucydides, observed that in relations between states, abstract concepts of justice and morality are almost always subordinated to raw power. Following the devastation of the Second World War, a scholar named Hans Morgenthau formalized these philosophical roots into a rigorous academic framework. Morgenthau established a core signpost for analyzing foreign policy: interest defined in terms of national power. He argued that the drive to dominate is a biological human trait, meaning states will always calculate their interests based on acquiring and keeping power. To analyze this objectively, Morgenthau insisted we must separate the moral aspirations of an individual from the moral obligations of a state. An individual might choose to sacrifice themselves for a moral principle. A state leader cannot make that choice for millions of citizens. For a state, the supreme moral imperative is physical and cultural survival. Therefore, international politics operates with complete autonomy from standard personal ethics. Classical realism treats conflict as an inevitable tragedy rooted in unchangeable human flaws. In a world driven by ego, maintaining a careful balance of power is the only, albeit fragile, tool available to prevent total war. By the 1970s, a new generation of scholars noticed a mechanical flaw in Morgenthau's logic. If human nature is a constant, if people are always selfish, it cannot explain variance. A constant cannot explain why we experience both periods of intense, devastating war and decades of prolonged peace. Political scientist Kenneth Waltz provided a different answer. He shifted the focus away from human nature entirely. Waltz argued that the international system itself, that outermost shell of our map, is the true independent variable driving state behavior. Waltz's theory is known as structural realism, or neorealism. He modeled anarchy as a structural condition. Because there is no higher authority to enforce agreements, trust becomes mathematically impossible, regardless of whether a specific leader has benevolent intentions. This creates a trap known as the security dilemma. When one state builds up its military to increase its own security, it automatically decreases the security of its neighbors. Those neighbors respond by arming themselves, creating an arms race fueled purely by structural fear. Within this structural view, a debate emerged over how much power a state actually needs. Waltz advanced defensive realism, arguing that states generally seek just enough power to maintain the balance and ensure their own survival. Scholar John Mearsheimer pushed this logic further with offensive realism. Mearsheimer argued that because a state can never be completely certain of another state's future intentions, survival requires maximizing relative power. The rational goal is to achieve regional hegemony, dominating your hemisphere so thoroughly that no neighbor dares attack. Structural realism strips away the psychology. It moves the focus from bad men to a bad system. It demonstrates that in a self-help architecture, conflict isn't driven by malice. It is a rational outcome of the geometry of the system itself. Yet pure structural realism had its own anomalies. If states automatically balance against raw aggregate power, as Waltz suggested, then the rest of the world should have universally united against the United States after 1945. That didn't happen. To resolve this, Stephen Walt refined the model with his balance of threat theory. Walt argued that states do not balance against a spreadsheet of raw capabilities. They balance against perceived threat. He identified 4 distinct determinants that make a state threatening: its overall aggregate power, its geographic proximity, its offensive military capabilities, and its perceived intentions. This map shows the division of Cold War Europe. Look at the geographic proximity of the Soviet bloc. Western European states chose to ally with the distant United States. The US had vast aggregate power, but the Soviet Union was right on their borders, possessed massive offensive land capabilities, and was perceived as having highly aggressive intentions. Those localized perceptions of threat directly drove the formation of permanent collective security institutions like NATO. A weaker but highly aggressive neighbor is mathematically more dangerous than a distant superpower. At the same time, theorists like Thomas Schelling were exploring how actors actually navigate this high-threat environment. Schelling developed strategic realism, using mathematical game theory to analyze deterrence and coercion. In his book, The Strategy of Conflict, Schelling outlined the core paradox of the nuclear age. To avoid mutually assured destruction, a state's threat of retaliation had to be absolutely credible. Deterrence requires convincing your opponent that you are willing to fight the very war you are desperately trying to prevent. These refinements showed that structural power doesn't operate in a vacuum. A state's raw capabilities are only activated as a causal variable when filtered through the lenses of geography, strategy, and perceived intent. While structural realism is excellent at predicting broad systemic trends over time, it struggles with specifics. It cannot fully explain why 2 different states, facing the exact same systemic pressures, might choose completely different foreign policy responses. This gap led to the development of neoclassical realism in the 1990s. This approach finally attempts to pry open the black box of the state layer in order to fully explain that variance. Thinkers like Fareed Zakaria recognize that international pressures don't dictate policy perfectly. They integrated systemic incentives with domestic political constraints. In the neoclassical model, the international distribution of power is still the independent variable. The structure still creates the pressure, but that pressure is filtered through intervening variables at the domestic level. Those intervening variables include a state's institutional capacity, the cohesion of its political elites, and how its leaders personally perceive the outside world. The systemic pressure goes in, gets chewed up by domestic politics, and a specific foreign policy comes out. For instance, a state might clearly recognize a rising threat on its border, but if its domestic political system is too fragmented or corrupt to extract taxes and build a military, it will fail to balance that threat, despite the demands of the international system. By bridging these levels of analysis, neoclassical realism provides the most comprehensive version of the theory. It maps the heavy outside-in pressures of global anarchy against the messy inside-out execution of domestic politics. Despite its immense analytical utility, the realist paradigm has deep blind spots. Critics argue that its singular obsession with power and survival makes it entirely lopsided. One major challenge comes from the feminist critique. Scholar Anne J. Tickner pointed out that the traditional realist definition of security, focused heavily on military force and state autonomy, carries a historical masculinist bias. Tickner argued that by defining objectivity purely through the lens of physical domination, realism offers only a partial description of international politics. It ignores how national interest is actually multidimensional and dependent on social context. Other schools, like constructivism, go even further. They argue that the interstate anarchy realists treat as a law of physics is actually an artificial construction. In their view, anarchy is what states make of it, a product of shared practices and discourse, not an inescapable trap. Yet, realism maintains its hold on international relations for one specific reason: its brutal clarity regarding the minimum baseline of statehood. When diplomacy fails, survival is the only metric that matters. We can trace this focus as it evolved. It started with Morgenthau blaming the innate ego of human nature. It expanded when Waltz mapped the structural mathematics of the system. And it matured when neoclassical scholars integrated the frictions of domestic politics. Realism was never intended to be a moral guide for how the world should be. It is a diagnostic map of how the world operates the moment central authority fails. The axioms of anarchy remain relevant because they describe our baseline reality. As long as the global architecture remains a self-help environment, the cold logic of power will continue to dictate the boundaries of peace.